Welcome, dear listeners, to this episode of the Carolina Haints podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. Theodosia Burr Alston was born into a life of privilege. Her father was Aaron Burr, vice president to Thomas Jefferson. Her mother, Theodosia Barstow Prevost Burr, was a key supporter of the American Revolution, and she married Joseph Alston, the governor of South Carolina. So, of course, Theodosia wanted for nothing, right? Well, as we all know, life seems to find a way to throw us a curveball. Aaron Burr was a highly decorated soldier during the Revolution, rising to the ranks of colonel before having to resign for health reasons. After leaving the front lines of the war, Burr continued to support the Revolution in whatever way he could. Meanwhile, Burr studied in New York and became a lawyer. This led him into the world of politics. Over the next few years, he served as the New York Attorney General and then was elected to the United States Senate in 1791. In 1796, he ran for the presidency, but lost to John Adams. Burr hatched a plan for the election of 1800. He worked with Thomas Jefferson, helping secure votes for Jefferson in exchange for Burr serving as vice president. This time, his plan succeeded, and Aaron Burr became the vice president to the third president of the United States. However, Jefferson didn't really trust or like Burr and dropped him from the ticket in 1804. Both of her parents were adamant that Theodosia would receive as much or more of an education as any wealthy male child. She absorbed all the training that her father's tutors could give her. She worshipped her father, and wanting nothing more than to delight him with her progress. And delight him she did. She was tutored in a wide variety of subjects, the classics, arithmetic, language, music, dance, and even horsemanship. By the age of 3, she could read and write. And before the age of 10, she had read the 4,000-page Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Her mother passed away in 1794 when Theodosia was just 11, but her father never let her education falter despite his own lofty political aspirations. She studied a variety of languages, Greek, Latin, French, alongside English composition. During the course of her life, Theodosia practiced her composition by writing endless letters to her father. She wrote thousands of letters to her father, and he responded to every single one. He also corrected and critiqued them. At an early age, she became widely known for her academic accomplishments. While the Burr family was quite well-to-do, Theodosia's mother was really the affluent one of the relationship. Plus, Aaron Burr's political aspirations came at a pretty large financial cost. Following her mother's death, Aaron Burr found himself fretting over money matters. Since Aaron and his daughter were close, this was a burden they shared. In 1801, Theodosia found a solution she hoped would alleviate her father's woes. She married Joseph Alston, and they were the first couple ever on record as having honeymooned at Niagara Falls. Joseph Alston was born to a wealthy family in All Saints Parish, South Carolina. He was in the law program at the College of New Jersey, known today as Princeton, but left before graduating. That didn't stop him from getting a job at a prestigious South Carolina law firm and continuing to study law on his own. In 1797, he passed the bar exam for South Carolina, but never actually practiced law. Instead, he invested a large portion of the family's money into land and slaves. The investment paid off as Joseph Alston's rice plantation made him the wealthiest man in South Carolina. Alston looked to parlay his financial success into the world of politics, but the people of South Carolina didn't like him very much. Enter Theodosia. Her and Alston discussed that a union between them could be mutually beneficial. Alston had enough money to erase Aaron Burr's debt, and the Burr name carried enough clout as to sway the election for Alston. The infamous duel between Aaron and Alexander Hamilton had not yet taken place. Yet Joseph Alston was rewarded with a seat in the South Carolina House of Representatives. Soon after, Theodosia wrote to her father that, while the marriage may have started out of convenience, that she had formed an affection for Alston, and in 1802, the couple had a son, Aaron Burr Alston. In 1807, when Aaron Burr was arrested for treason, Joseph Alston stood with Burr at his trial. Even though Aaron Burr was never found guilty of a crime, he was still forced to leave the country. During the 4.5 years that Burr was in exile, Theodosia continued to send him letters and money. She also wrote letters to the Secretary of the Treasury, begging for her father's return. When Thomas Jefferson left office in 1809, Theodosia also wrote letters to Dolly Madison, wife of the new president, James Madison. Finally, in June of 1812, arrangements were made for Aaron Burr's return to New York. He arrived a month later, but instead of that year being the most joyous of Theodosia's life, as it should have been, it turned out to be her lowest point. The first tragedy of 1812 was her son, Aaron. You see, South Carolina summers were well known for outbreaks of malaria. Back in those days, no one knew that malaria was carried by mosquitoes, or that the vast swamps and rice plantations of South Carolina were perfect breeding grounds for the bloodthirsty insects. Alston had a way of protecting his plantation workers. He paid extra to have slaves brought from areas of Africa with very high rates of childhood malaria. That way, he knew that if he had a slave that survived the disease as a child, they were less likely to suffer from it as an adult. He could do little, however, to protect his own family. Originally, Theodosia and their son spent summer months up north with their father in New York. However, Burr's exile changed all that. In June of 1812, Aaron Burr Alston contracted malaria and passed away. Ironically, just 2 weeks before Aaron Burr's return from Europe. He was just 10 years old. Her son's death and the torment that it caused her weighed heavily against Theodosia's health. This and the War of 1812 prevented her from making the trip to welcome her father home until that December. In early December, Theodosia's husband had been appointed governor of South Carolina, so he was unable to accompany her on her journey. Alston arranged for a close friend, Timothy Green, to escort her in his stead. The governor chartered the fastest ship he could find, the Patriot, to carry Green, Theodosia, and her handmaid on their journey northward. Among her chest and baggage, Theodosia brought along a portrait of herself to present to her father. Many ships in that era were used as privateers. A privateer is when the government hires private ships to carry out military raids at sea. The Patriot had been operating as a privateer for several months, raiding and plundering British ships. No matter what you call them, privateers were basically government-sanctioned pirates. To conceal the Patriot's recent privateering reputation, the ship was repainted and its name changed. On December 31st, 1812, the Patriot left the port of Georgetown, South Carolina, and was never seen again. Several rumors began to circulate when the schooner did not arrive at its destination. Through the years, some evidence surfaced to support many of the speculations. With each piece of alleged evidence surfaced, historians had one more piece to the puzzle of Theodosia's disappearance. After a while, the full story could be surmised. In the 1800s, the Carolina Bankers were not a financial organization. They were an outlaw group affiliated with the most notorious pirate of the day, Dominic York. The bankers didn't have ships fast enough to chase down their prey, so they devised a brilliant, albeit cruel, plan to bring the ships to them. At low tide, the sandbanks off Nag's Head were above water. The bankers would tie a lantern around a horse's neck, injure one of its legs, and then lead it back and forth across the sand. In the dark, the slow bobbing light resembled a boat securely lashed to the dock. Unsuspecting ships, looking for shelter and provisions, would steer toward the light thinking they had reached a port. They would then run aground on the shallow sandbanks and find themselves under attack by the bankers' ships. This was a process known as Nag's Head, hence the name of the town. All indications are that such was the fate of the Patriot. In 3 separate trials, men convicted of piracy confessed to scuttling a ship in January of 1813. They said that there was a young woman on board who kept talking about going to visit her father in New York. Also, a woman claimed that when she was young, around the same time frame, the body of a woman had washed ashore near her family's farm. She said the corpse was wearing an expensive gown and showed every indication of wealth and refinement. The family buried her on their farm. And then there's the portrait that Theodosia took with her on the schooner. In 1869, it came to be in the ownership of Dr. William Poole of Elizabeth City, although at the time he had no idea that he possessed such an important piece of history. The portrait had been given to him as payment by an old, destitute woman named Polly Tillett Mann. According to Mann, during the War of 1812, the deserted ship drifted into the port at Nag's Head. The townsmen searched the derelict vessel. It had obviously been ransacked before being set adrift, and all coin, treasure, and anything of obvious worth had already been taken. But the personal effects of the crew and passengers were left behind. In the stateroom of the ship, they found expensive silk dresses scattered across the floor. The pirates either had no use for such fine attire or didn't know of their extreme value. The men gathered up the dresses to take to their wives and girlfriends. By the time John Tillett got to the stateroom, all the fine dresses were gone, but there was an oil painting hanging on the wall. He took the painting back to his fiancée Polly. The portrait hung in their home for many years. After John Tillett passed away, Polly remarried and became Polly Tillett Mann, whose husband eventually passed away, and Mrs. Mann fell on hard times. In 1869, when Dr. Poole came to visit her, the portrait was the only thing of any value she had left to give him. Dr. Poole had an artist friend examine the painting, and he found it to be of a very professional style. The gown and jewels that the subject wore identified her as a woman of obvious wealth and breeding. Dr. Poole hung the portrait in his study and didn't really give it much thought until years later, when he read a magazine article about Theodosia Burr Alston and her mysterious disappearance. There was a picture that accompanied the article, and Dr. Poole felt that it closely resembled the woman in the portrait. Convinced that the portrait was that of Theodosia, Poole contacted many of Burr's relatives as they would listen. Many of them came to Poole's house in Elizabeth City to witness the painting for themselves. Their conclusions were indecisive. A couple of them positively identified the woman in the portrait as Theodosia, while others were not so sure. Yet they could not deny the striking similarity of the women. Historians have compared the portrait to other paintings that are documented as being of Theodosia and have acknowledged that the painting is authentic. It now hangs in Farmington, Connecticut, at Yale University. Even though the convicted pirates confessed to killing everyone aboard the Patriot, there are many of those that say that Theodosia was taken to Bald Head Island to be held for ransom. As the daughter of the former vice president and the wife of the most powerful man in South Carolina, she would have been worth more to them alive than dead. Theodosia was as clever as she was beautiful and managed to escape her captors, but she may not have realized that she was on an island. 3 guards were sent to bring her back, and as they were closing in on her, and having no way off the island, Theodosia threw herself into the ocean rather than being recaptured. When the guards returned empty-handed, they were beheaded. Rumor has it that the men can still be seen roaming the island in search of the young woman who had eluded them. During World War II, the Coast Guard kept men on Bald Head Island to watch for enemy submarines. One evening, 2 men were patrolling on horseback when they saw a woman in the distance. The island was off limits to civilians during those years. The trespasser wore a long, flowing green dress and was staring out into the surf. The men yelled for her to stay where she was and identify herself. She turned toward them and disappeared into thin air. Several days later, they saw the woman again. This time she was walking slowly toward them. Unsettled, the men once more called for her to halt and identify herself, but she kept walking toward them. One of the men shouldered his rifle, as the other guard demanded that the woman stop where she was at. Again, she ignored their order. The man fired, and to his dismay, the bullet passed right through the emerald green dress and kicked up sand in the beach behind her. Then, as before, she slowly faded from sight, leaving the men confused and bewildered. The next day, the men were talking about what they had seen at a bar in Southport, North Carolina. An elderly fisherman overheard them and said, "So you've seen her too, the ghost of Theodosia Burr?" The old man told them his story. He said that he had seen the woman many years earlier, when the war was just beginning. He too came across a woman in a long dress staring out to the sea. As he approached her, the woman turned to him, pointed out towards the water, in the direction that she had been looking. She seemed to be trying to tell him something, but then the man realized that he could see right through the woman. Her green dress was not material enough to block out the driftwood laying on the beach behind her. The fisherman panicked and ran away. Back safely at home, he wondered what it was she was trying to tell him. The following morning, the man heard that an oil tanker had been torpedoed directly off the beach, where he had seen the apparition. The man was sure that the ghost of Theodosia Burr had been trying to warn him about the coming attack. During a recent trip to the Outer Banks, my wife and I enjoyed a walking ghost tour in which they told a more ghastly tale of Theodosia's disappearance. This tale begins with poor Theodosia, desperate to spend the holidays with her father, got him to pull some strings and drafted a document signed by the governors of each state she was to pass by, advising that she is to travel unmolested. So when her ship was accosted off the shores of the Outer Banks, and as every single person on board was garroted and thrown overboard to hungry sharks, Theodosia eagerly displayed her document. The pirates, who used the Nag's Head trick to wreck her ship, agreed to save her for last, forcing her to watch as they butchered every other passenger and crew member first. When it got to Theodosia's turn, the story is she went ballistic and seemed to lose her mind. The superstitious pirates let her flee the boat, fearing that she may be contagious. As this particular legend goes, Theodosia clung to her portrait and ran onto land, where she eventually collapsed. She was found by a married couple out walking the beach who took her in and cared for her. Apparently having suffered a profound mental breakdown, Theodosia was able to talk, and the couple who cared for her had no idea who she was or how to help her other than taking her in. The story goes that they continued to care for her into her old age, when her health began to decline and a doctor was sent to care for the elderly Theodosia. Not having money to pay for the doctor for his services, he agreed to take Theodosia's portrait as payment. It was then, finally, after decades of silence and infirmness, that the elderly lady stood up and loudly proclaimed to be Theodosia Burr, before running out the front door and straight into the ocean, where she drowned. The legend continues that Theodosia can be seen walking the beach along with the ghostly apparition of the glowing nag's head. The story that Aaron Burr considered to be the truth behind his daughter's disappearance was a shipwreck in which all members died. Burr would never entertain the idea that Theodosia could have survived and may be held against her will by pirates. Perhaps it was just simply easier to believe that she had passed away. Robert Frost wrote the poem Kitty Hawk to commemorate the 1903 first flight of the Wright brothers. The poem is included in Frost's last book, In the Clearing, published in 1963. Frost wrote the poem based on the two occasions that he had visited Kitty Hawk, once in 1894 when he was 19, and then again in 1953 for the 50th anniversary of the first flight. The poem is lengthy at 473 lines, allowing him to tell how he met a man in Elizabeth City who told him the story of Theodosia Burr and the Coast Guardsman. Here's a short excerpt of the poem. There I next fell in with a lone coast guard on midnight patrol, who, as of a sect, asked about my soul, and where all I'd been, apropos of sin. Did I recollect how the wreckers wrecked Theodosia Burr off this very shore? 'Twas to punish her, but her father more. We don't know for what, there was no confession. Things they think she wore still sometimes occur in someone's possession here at Kitty Hawk. We can have no notion of the strange devotion Burr had for his daughter. He was too devoted. For more information on this story, check out Daniel Barefoot's North Carolina Haunted 100 Volume 1, Seaside Specters. Also check out John Harden's The Devil's Tramping Ground and other North Carolina mystery stories. There's In the Clearing by Robert Frost, Haunted Wilmington and the Cape Fear Coast, a collection of true ghost stories by Brooks Newton Preek, and Legends of the Outer Banks and Tar Heel Tidewater by Charles Harry Wedby. Check out Ghost Tours of the Outer Banks at ghosttoursoftheobx.com. This episode was researched and written by Jeff Cochran and was produced and hosted by me, Dan Sellers. You can find more information on Jeff's work at adarkerworld.com, and you can find everything we're up to at our company, Breakhabit Productions, at breakhabitproductions.com. You can find Carolina Haints on iTunes, Google Play, now on iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Please subscribe and leave us a review. And please consider contributing to our endeavors at patreon.com/wreakhavoc. We've been fortunate to be able to bring you this podcast without any advertisements. However, each episode of the show costs money to produce and publish. Whether you give a one-time gift or a continuing small monthly contribution, anything you can do to help will be greatly appreciated and will go toward keeping this show going. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Tune in then to hear more about the things that go bump in the night.